In 1945, we invented the atomic bomb.
Atomic bomb.
Cities that were devastated by atomic bombs.
That was the first thing that humans built that could wipe out everything on the planet. Fast forward to 1970s, and now it's climate change.
Climate change.
Climate change. Climate change.
Climate change. Climate change.
Is the thing that's starting to become a concern. Then in 2014, it's AI.
AI is far more dangerous than nukes.
Fast forward to 2020, and now it's man-made viruses.
Laboratories today are working to make viruses even more deadly than COVID-19.
Not to forget all the other ones that I didn't even mention. So as time goes on, our civilization just keeps creating new things that could end the entire human race. While these things may seem unrelated, there are underlying reasons why they keep popping up, and today we're going to explore them. Now, to understand Moloch, let me first give you an analogy. The way to think about this is that imagine that there's a bunch of track runners all competing with each other. Someone builds a new type of technology called steroids that one of the athletes decide to take, which gives them a major advantage. For the other athletes to still compete with him, they're forced to adopt steroids as well. Before you know it, every track runner in the competition is using steroids just to stay in the same place with each other. Now, there might be some ways of trying to stop this by using rules and agreements and monitoring all the athletes. What makes it hard is that athletes can publicly say that they're following an agreement
when I've never taken performance-enhancing drugs,
but be lying the entire time.
Accuses Lance Armstrong of using performance-enhancing drugs.
The only person who knows if an athlete is following an agreement is pretty much the athlete themselves. And since it's hard to tell if an athlete is following an agreement, it makes sense for everyone in the sport to not follow the agreement so that someone won't get an unfair advantage over them. The thing that the athlete are being optimized for might very well be great for the short term, but horrible for everyone in the long term. And it's fair to say that the world would be a much better place if the tech didn't exist to begin with. Now let's use another example where the competition is crime, the actors are criminals, citizen, and police, and the advantage is guns. When a criminal adopts a new technology, it forces the entire police force to adopt the same one. For example, you'll see in a 1997 North Hollywood shootout where there was 2 bank robbers who was equipped with assault rifles, bulletproof vests, etc. Since the police had never needed to deal with anything like this before, they were equipped with no bulletproof vests and revolvers that couldn't even penetrate the robber's body armor. The criminals ended up injuring many different police officers during the robbery. After the incident, it forced every police department across America to switch from wearing something like this to wearing something like this. Nowadays, every police officer has a bulletproof vest, a much more powerful handgun, and multiple ammo clips just to be on the same playing field as the criminals. Now, if you listen to what gun owners say,
Americans have the right to own a gun for self-defense.
I feel better having one knowing that the bad guys have access to them everywhere.
When the bad guys have guns like this, the good guys ought to have guns like this.
I think the bad guys have guns, so we should all arm ourselves too.
One reason they decided to purchase a gun is that they want to have the same sort of technology that the criminal has, just in case there's a home invasion or a robbery, so the criminal doesn't have an unfair advantage over them. So the new tech forces everyone to adopt it, even though the world will be a much better place if the tech didn't even exist to begin with. Now take what I said and apply this to a leading superpower. You can break up the competition of leading superpower into military and the economy. Let's first start with the military. The actors can be the country, and then the advantage can be weapons. You can think of every civilization has to build a military and then optimize it in order to not get wiped out by their neighboring country. For example, this is how you get the Roman Empire completely wiping out ancient Greece, or Genghis Khan conquering 8+ kingdoms, or Hitler conquering most countries in Europe. To not have your entire civilization wiped out, you are forced to adopt a military and then optimize your military. Now, if we think about it for a second, you can pretty much take anything and then use it as a weapon. You can use glue that is normally used for shapes and crafts, toilet paper that's normally used to go to the bathroom. They combine it, then make a knife.
Today I'm gonna show you how you make a prison knife out of toilet paper. Check it out.
Hey guys, so today I attempted to make a knife out of completely toilet paper, and as you can see, it came out pretty well.
This is what some prisoners have been found to do when they're in prison. Now let's look at another example, but this time with airplanes. The Wright brothers end up inventing a plane. Right after that, I can use a plane for transportation, or I can use it to drop bombs on people. I could take a rocket that was used to go to the moon and the reactions in a nuclear power plant, combine them two, stick them together, and then blow up an entire city via nuclear warhead. I can take the same sort of AI technology that allows me to identify objects like stop signs and street lamps that we see in self-driving cars, take that and then use it to better identify certain types of people.
Developing facial recognition and AI software to repress the Uyghurs.
I can use computers to help build a hospital computer network, or use computers to make a cipher hack that shuts down hospitals like the WannaCry hack in 2017. AI revolution started around 2012, and drones are a new thing that popped up less than 20 years ago. I now can combine them two and then make an AI weaponized drone. We can keep going with this. You'll see this dual use with ships, you'll see this with helicopters, you'll see this with cars, etc. Now, if you noticed, these are all technologies that were built in the past 100 years, but we can even go backwards to things like dynamite, bow and arrows, etc. Now, I really want you to think. A rocket to go to the moon is 10,000 times more powerful than a bow and arrow. Meanwhile, both got weaponized to build a nuclear warhead and archery. Now, I want you to think, if we just look at this trend, whatever the technology is that's 10,000 times more powerful than the current technology we have now, whether that's AI, nanotechnology, quantum computers, etc., will most likely get weaponized. The cost to do it will go down, the number of employees that it takes to build it will go down, and then the number of countries with it will go up. Since no country can tell if another one is building the tech or not, very similar to how no athlete can tell if another athlete is on steroids or not, it makes sense for everyone to build the weapons to not get wiped out by another country. This is why in the early 1900s there was 2 nuclear superpowers, while today there are 9. Not only will this happen with countries, you can see the same sort of thing happening with a single individual. The ability to go from a school shooter with an AK-47 to a high schooler creating millions of dollars in damage via hacking to different companies, to a homemade drone creating hundreds of millions of dollars in damage in 2017. You can see the same sort of trend with tech becoming much more powerful and much more decentralized, becoming easier for someone to go rogue and create a lot of harm. Now let's take this one step further. You and I can debate about what the origins of the pandemic were. Maybe it came from bats, maybe it came from a lab, but you can think of the same sort of dynamic as at play when it comes to genetically engineering diseases. Today it might take $100 million, in 20 years it might only take 10. Today it might take 1,000 employees to do it, in 20 years it might only take 100. Now let's even take this one step further. Many argue that nukes actually stopped something like World War III, which I'm actually in agreement with them on. Here's the catch. Depending on who you ask, there have been several times where there was serious consideration of using a nuke. Rather it's the 1983 false alarm, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Norway rocket incident, and that's not even including all the classified stuff that no one knows anything about. And let me just highlight something. They have only been out for about 80 years. It's not like nukes has been out for 1,000+ years or so. If nothing changes and you just keep rolling out these trends, whether it's 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now, we go extinct. Real quick, if you guys like what you see so far, consider subscribing to my Patreon. For every documentary I release, I take a bunch of your responses from the YouTube comments and then respond to them in a dedicated video. I also released the script and 100+ infographic file that it takes to make these videos. I just dropped the response video for why things don't get better in the United States. One reason you can consider is very similar to how the printing press broke the feudal system. You could argue that Facebook broke democracy. So if any of these stuff interests you, or you just want to support the channel, consider subscribing. I appreciate you, and back to the video. For our next competition, we can think of the economy. For our actors, we can say countries and the adoption of anything profitable. If the fish in the ocean is worth $0 alive, but 100K dead, and then using the fish for food is a cheap alternative, then all the fish in the ocean will get extracted. If someone decided to pick a more expensive alternative food source, they would get outcompeted. The tree is worth $0 alive, but $10,000 dead, and using of wood for building material as a cheaper alternative, then all the trees in the Amazon rainforest will get cut. Something profitable might be a resource or something potentially harmful. A bunch of people were talking about the dangers of AI.
AI is far more dangerous than nukes.
ChatGPT comes out, and instead of searching Google, looking through a whole bunch of blue links for the answer to my question, I can just ask ChatGPT and it gives me the answer directly. For OpenAI to not hurt Google's core business model, search, Google is forced to build AI as well. You can think of every country has an incentive to not regulate AI so it doesn't hurt their economy. This is how you get in a situation like the EU. Despite them having the second biggest economy in the world, they barely produce any new technology companies. Just look at the top companies in the world and barely any of them are in the EU. The EU tends to regulate tech much more than any of the other countries. The downside of this is that it hurts the startups there, so they decide to move from the EU to the US, where the jobs, the venture capitalists, and the tech revenue all go with the tech startup. When you try to regulate AI, you hurt your economy. Something similar happens with a carbon tax. If you're the only country that makes a carbon tax and no other country makes a carbon tax, then you will be outcompeted by every single other country, so it makes sense for you not to make a carbon tax. Now you can take all of this and what the thing that comes out, giving me an advantage over you, forcing you to adopt the same thing, leading to everyone in a way worse situation. This is what we call Moloch. The second part of this is called the superorganism. Now the first thing I want you to think of is economic growth, aka GDP. GDP is a measure of consumer spending plus business investment plus government spending plus export minus imports. You can think of consumers such as me and you buying a car, a house, food, books, clothing, etc. You can think of business investment into lab research, skyscrapers, factories, laboratory, robotic equipment, mining site, etc. You can think of government buying police cars, tanks, ships, hospitals, roads, etc. Exports is all the things I mentioned going overseas. Now, one thing that a lot of these items have in common is that they require some sort of energy to create or create and then run. And when I say energy, I want you to think of things that are made from oil, like gasoline and diesel. Think of things we use to generate electricity: solar to make electricity, nuclear to make electricity, coal to make electricity, natural gas, etc. For starters, I want to only focus on the energy it takes to create the product. I want you to think that every step in the creation process takes some sort of energy, whether it's extraction to manufacturing to shipping to getting your final product. Now let's take a computer as an example. We must mine lithium for the battery, sand for the glass, quartz for the silicon, and hundreds of other materials out of the ground. Think of some of the equipment: haul trucks, bulldozers, excavators, and other huge equipment all running off diesel, aka energy. Then we must manufacture the product. That uses hundreds of moving machines working 24/7. Everything including the factory uses a bunch of electricity generated from coal, aka energy. Now we must ship the product, whether that's on huge boats, 18-wheelers, delivery vans, FedEx trucks. All that runs off of diesel, aka energy. Now I just told you about the energy it takes to create the product, but the computer needs constant electricity generated by solar panels to constantly run the product. The same thing can be said with a car. You create the car, but to run it requires constant gasoline, aka energy. You create a building, but to run the lights, the plugs, etc., it requires constant electricity generated by coal, aka energy. There's three huge findings to what has just been said. Now I want you to look at this graph right here. What the top of this curve represents is how much energy the entire civilization is using. The further in time you go, the civilization just uses much more energy. At the beginning of the 1990s, this is how much renewables we were using then. This is how much we are using now. You can see that in the past 40 years, we are using much more renewables like solar and wind. Here's the catch. If you also look at how much natural gas, oil, and coal that we are using, also known as non-renewables, also known as fossil fuels, you'll see that in the 90s, we were using this much, now we're using this much. We are using much more fossil fuels. And why is that? I want you to look at this diagram. Just imagine this is how much energy the entire civilization is using. You have some oil, some nuclear, and wind all thrown in there. Every time you have economic growth, also known as increased GDP, you're increasing how many products and services that are in the economy. Since every product takes some sort of energy to either create and or to run, you're increasing how much energy the entire civilization uses. This is why this curve just keeps looking like this. So when we are thinking about how well we are going from fossil fuels, oil, coal, natural gas, to renewable resources, and think about the trillions of dollars countries around the world are putting to stop climate change, you quickly realize that there has been zero transition at all. Think about all the electric vehicles, the nuclear power plants, the solar panels. Hasn't even slowed down how many fossil fuels we use. We're actually speeding up. Another way to think about it is that you'll have products and services all running off of fossil fuels. What happens is that you'll start replacing the old infrastructure with renewables. You'll increase GDP, which increases the number of products and services, but all the new stuff is running off of fossil fuels. You finally replace all the old infrastructure, but you'll increase GDP again, which increases the number of products and services again. And now you're in a way worse situation than when you started. This is one reason this graph looks like this. Another example is you'll start building renewables, but every new solar panel and wind turbine is not going towards replacing all the old oil infrastructure with renewables, but is pretty much going towards the growing number of products and services that the civilization just created. Now we can circle back to economic growth. As long as we keep the financial system, it's nearly impossible to switch to renewable resources because the entire civilization just keeps growing. Here's the second finding. If we look back at the process of creating a product or service, since we're increasing the number of products and services, we increase how much we use the entire manufacturing system as well. We find that any type of waste generated during the creation process increases as we increase GDP. This is how we get every environmental problem, ranging from growing global CO2 emissions and harmful chemicals in the atmosphere to trash in the ocean and the extraction of everything. All of them increase as we increase GDP. When I say increasing harmful chemicals, let's take lead as an example. We used to put lead in gasoline to prevent engine knocking, then we burn it and put it all in the atmosphere, and now if you're born between 1960 and 1970, your IQ is 6 points lower than what it should be just because of lead. Lead in the air knocked off about 1 billion IQ points off the planet, and let me just highlight, that is one chemical. One chemical was able to do this. There are approximately hundreds of millions of chemicals, and as we increase GDP, we increase the number of chemicals that are in the atmosphere. If we look at the rates of cancer, autism, lower sperm counting, you'll find that they correlate with GDP. Is it the only reason why those effects are happening? No. Is it a major contributor? Yes. When I say trash, let's only take plastic.
Plastic pollution, a planetary crisis.
Plastics in the ocean have been building up for decades.
In an underwater paradise, a plastic nightmare.
Let me also give you a fun fact. It turns out since we wrap so much food and drinks in plastic, small microplastics are being found in plaque in our arteries. So microplastics are contributing towards heart attacks and strokes. So if we look at all the plastics that are in the ocean and the fact that they're clogging our arteries, are we transitioning off of plastics?
The industry that makes plastic is expanding. It's estimated that global production of plastic will triple.
A plastic boom.
We're not slowing down, we're speeding up. Why is that? You triple GDP, you triple the number of products and services, and most of them require some sort of plastic, so you triple the amount of plastic. Simple as that. The third thing this reveals is why most initial solutions you think would fix this would fail and then make things worse because of something called Jevons Paradox. Let's first start with the energy required to create something. Let's examine the manufacturing process, focusing only on the manufacturing stage. First, we take our natural gas, aka energy, to generate electricity to power the factory that makes the car. If a manufacturer decided to switch from natural gas to solar panels, and solar panels happen to produce much more electricity for far less money, the fact that there is way more electricity available than there was before will lower the cost. Think of it in terms of demand and supply. Normally, demand is equal to supply. If suddenly there is more supply, electricity, the price drops until demand is equal to supply once again. Now this has two huge consequences. You see the company bill before the transition is $300K, and after the transition is $150K. What happens is the company then takes their savings and spends that on a new product. The company now individually uses much more energy than he did before, increasing how much energy the entire civilization uses, and further increasing every environmental issue despite him being in good faith. Secondly, let's go back to our manufacturing process. Since the cheaper electricity acts like a chain reaction where electricity gets cheaper, the cost to run the factory becomes cheaper, leading to the car to become cheaper. Now, if there are people who can't buy the car at $50,000 but can at $40,000, because of our chain reaction, more people just start buying cars. Now we just increase the amount of energy the entire civilization uses, plus all of the environmental problems once again. We could even take it a step further again. where we have an eco-friendlier car that travels way further on way less gasoline. What happens is that you'll end up traveling way more because it's now cheaper to travel, or you'll take your savings and buy a new product or service. In both cases, you individually use more energy, further increasing every environmental problem. This is what's known as Jevons Paradox. Rather, it's getting better at making energy, as in the case with our solar panels, or getting better at using energy in the case with our car. It makes the entire civilization use much more energy and increase every environmental problem since you take your savings and invest that into a new product or service. This is why the graphs keep looking like this, and we are no closer to solving climate change than we were 15 years ago, or any environmental problem, despite our best effort. Now, you might be asking, if this is true, why on earth are United States emissions going down? Simple. If I manufacture something here in the United States, then it counts towards US emissions. If I take the same product, then manufactured in China, then import it, then it doesn't count. So US emissions are going down simply because we export all of it to China and then import it, and then it doesn't count anymore. That's why you must look at global emissions. A second question you might be asking is, why not just stop growing GDP since it's causing all of these other problems? My answer is that you can't, because you'll hyperinflate the currency. To understand this, you must understand how the entire financial system works. So let's walk through it. The way to think about this is that GDP, aka the size of the economy, dictates how much money the government brings in from taxes. The bigger the economy is, the more money the government can bring in from taxes. Let's look at these products again. The more companies there are, the more money I can bring in from corporate tax. The more cars that are sold, the more money I can bring in from sales tax. The more houses that are built, the more money I can bring in from property tax, roughly speaking. Now, let's say for some reason we can't grow the economy anymore and we must increase the tax rate. You can think of the higher the tax rate is, the more incentive there is to avoid paying it. You'll see this manifest in a couple different ways. One way is moving from California to Florida, because Florida doesn't have a statewide income tax, so your expenses there are just way lower. Another way is, in the early days of a company, putting your company shares in a Roth IRA to pay no capital gains tax. Back then they were only worth $100, but now they're worth $2 billion, and no taxes need to be paid on them whatsoever. This is somewhat what Peter Thiel did, which I find quite clever. Or if it's Apple setting up a second company in Ireland, then exporting all the money to an Irish bank account to pay Ireland's corporate taxes of 12% instead of United States 21%. So one way for a country to avoid all of these tax avoidance schemes is by just growing the size of the economy while keeping the tax rates the same. Now, the government is bringing in all this money from taxes to pay its bills. We can demonstrate this with the revenue and expenses chart, or in other words, all the money that's coming into the government and all the money that's going out of the government. Everything going into the government is all the things such as taxes, as we talked about before, and everything that's going out is national defense, Medicare, Social Security, etc. Very similar to how United States government works with money coming in and out, your bank account works the same way. You bring in enough money from your job to pay the bills. Money coming in is your salary, and then the money going out is your groceries, clothing, etc. Now, if you decide to buy a house, you first get a loan from a bank, and then you make payments. First, you get the $300,000 loan, then you pay back a certain amount each month or year. Paying back the loan increases the amount of money going out of my bank account. So now you have to pay bills plus a mortgage payment, and you must do this until the entire loan is paid off. We can take this step further. The same thing happens with car loans. You get a loan from a bank and then pay back a certain amount each month or year, which increases the amount of money that's going out of your bank account. Now you must pay bills plus the mortgage payment plus the car loan payment. Now, let's look at the United States. If the United States government wanted to get a loan, one way it could do this is by auctioning off a bunch of notes where no matter what the price is after the auction, the US would pay back $1,000 after a year. You'll have a bunch of people bidding on them. If a pension fund decides to buy one at a certain price, after a year, the United States will repay the pension fund $1,000. If the pension fund buys 1 million of them, that's essentially giving the United States $950 million loan. Or if the pension fund buys 100 million of them, that's essentially giving the United States a $95 billion loan. After a year, the US must pay back a huge amount of money. Just like how your expenses went up with your loan for your house, the US expenses just went up just to pay back their loan. Maybe there's another type of note where you buy it, The US pays a little each year, and then after 20 years, they give you your original amount back. Maybe you buy 1 million of these notes, essentially giving the US $1 billion, or maybe you buy 100 million notes, essentially giving the US $100 billion. The US pays a little back each year, and afterwards, it gives you your original amount back. With this, the US expenses have just increased again. Now it has bills, plus pay back the pension fund, plus paying back Canada. Now I want you to abstract this, and then instead of having two organizations, think about millions of organizations all around the world that have all given loans to the United States. We can now combine all of these and rename it payback loans. Let's go back to you when you have a mortgage and a car loan. You're now $350K in debt and must pay back those loans. If you get another loan, it increases this further. The US total amount it has ever borrowed is the national debt. This is why the national debt is so important, because if the national debt rises, the amount of money we must pay back increases as well. Now the US government usually gets a loan whenever it doesn't have enough money to pay its bills by filling in this gap. Now, if all the other bills for the United States stays the same, its expenses will increase the following year just to pay back the loan. Now let's look at what happens if I didn't grow my economy, but I kept having these expenses being the same every year. You can think I first get a loan to cover the gap. The loan that I got to cover the gap is mostly funded by the public, but for anything the government couldn't raise is then covered by the central bank, aka the bank that issues the currency. Here's the catch. If you know anything about a bank giving someone a loan, then you know the bank is creating money out of thin air every single time it does this. Just look at an assets and liabilities balance sheet, or in other words, all the things that people own and all the things that these people owe. On the left, you own your cash, you own your house, you own your car. On the right, you owe a car loan, you owe a mortgage, you owe credit card debt. Now imagine we had 3 different people, all with 100K in cash. As soon as these people put their money in the bank, on their balance sheet, it goes from cash to bank deposits. On the balance sheet of the bank now owes these people all their money. Now let's add another balance sheet, but this time you, the viewer. Let's say the bank decides to loan you some money. Right there, that's how the bank creates money. These people already have their money they can use in the bank, and now you have an additional 100K you can also use. So the entire money supply has just increased from 300K to 400K. This is quite remarkable because if you take your cash and deposit it back into the bank, you can now see that there is indeed 400K in circulation simply by loaning people money. We can take this concept a step further. We can examine Kevin's balance sheet again. As soon as the bank gives him a 100K loan, the money supply increases once more. He can either use the cash and spend it or deposit it in a bank. If he does the latter, then the bank is now holding $500,000. Let's take this even further. Very similar to how we have these people put their money in a bank, you can think of the parallel would be banks all putting their money in a central bank. Where a retail bank banks at is at the central bank. If the central bank decided to give a loan to a government directly, just like the examples we gave before, it would be increasing the money supply. And since the government banks at the central bank, it would just be putting the newly created money right back into the bank. Now let's go back. Every time you run this gap, you must get a loan to make up the difference. The loan should always come from the public, but if the government can't raise money normally, then it can get it directly from the central bank. This is a sign of an unhealthy economy. When you get it from the central bank, you're increasing the price of everything. You can think of it in terms of demand and supply. Normally, a certain amount of dollars is chasing a certain number of products. If the central bank gives a loan and increases the money supply, normally we would increase the number of products to go along with it. If we don't grow the number of products in the economy, then the price of everything will increase until demand is equal to supply, also known as inflation. Now, if you remember, since we got a loan, my expenses increases the following year. Now, if I don't grow my economy, then I won't grow the number of products and services, which in turn I won't grow the amount of overall things I can tax, which won't grow how much money is coming into the country's bank account, which won't grow this green bar. I now must get an even bigger loan the following year, which increases my expenses the following year again. Now, when it's time for the government to raise money the following year, it becomes increasingly difficult since there are less people willing to give the government money. One reason is that investors will be more reluctant to lend money to the country if it shows signs that it won't be able to pay back its previous loans. Think of it this way: if you don't have a steady income coming in your bank account, why would a bank approve you for a car loan? They review your revenue and expenses and conclude you most likely wouldn't be able to pay back the loan, leading to the bank to lose money. A second reason is that if everything is becoming much more expensive simply because the value of the currency is going down, one thing I can do is buy something that is not connected to the currency, such as gold, Bitcoin, silver, etc. At the start, demand is equal to supply. Since the central bank is increasing the money supply, the price of everything rises until demand is equal to supply. We can run this bandwagon a third time where I must get an even bigger loan the following year. So more money must come from the central bank and less money comes from the public. Once again, since the central bank is increasing the money supply, the price of everything rises until demand is equal to supply. You can keep running this until it costs over $10 million for a car, which used to only cost $15K. The situation is way worse if you have a loan in another currency or people start selling your currency super fast. This is what's known as hyperinflation. And countries like Zimbabwe, Argentina, Venezuela, Germany in the 1920s, Hungary, Brazil, and many others all have experienced this. Now, there's a question about how on earth does one avoid something like this? Now, mainstream economics say that running this gap is okay if revenue is either growing with expenses or it's on track to one day outpace expenses in the following years. One year I get a loan, it makes my expenses increase the following year. To combat this, I must grow my economy, which grows the number of products and services, which grows the amount of overall things I can tax, which increases the amount of money that's coming into the US bank account, which is now going on track to catch expenses. Now, since I didn't catch expenses yet, but I'm showing progress that my economy is growing, the public will still be willing to loan me money. The following year, I get another loan to fill in a gap, which increases the expenses the following year. I must grow my economy again, which grows the number of products and services again, which grows the amount of overall things I can tax again, which increases how much money is coming into the United States bank account again, which finally catches expenses. Now, you may ask, how many years have the United States been doing this? Check out this chart. You can see that every bar that is red means that during that year, the United States had more money going out than it did coming in. So the United States had to get a loan that year. The green bar means that they had more money coming in than they had going out, so they didn't need to get a loan that year. This means that the United States had to get a loan to cover these gaps almost every year for the past 100 years. Second, the examples that I've shown are cases where paying back loans is the thing that is increasing expenses where everything else remains the same. What's super interesting is that these programs have naturally risen over time. Rather, it's spending more on the military every year since the US must build increasingly deadly tech to compete with other nations, or where people are getting older and we must spend more on Social Security and Medicare than we normally have done in the past. So these expenses just naturally rise. Lastly, once these expenses rise, it's nearly impossible to cut them. If we wanted to cut them, that will require cutting things like Social Security, Medicare, transportation, or any of the other extremely important things that Americans need. A politician trying to cut any of these is very unpopular with the public. If you combine the fact that these expenses naturally go up, how much the US must pay back keeps increasing for the past 100 years, and you can't cut the expenses because it's very unpopular with the public, that's the reason why you can't stop growing the economy, or you will hyperinflate the currency. Now, another question that you might have been wondering is, why on earth do we have to pay back the loans to begin with? What would happen if we just decided not to pay them? I have no idea, but absolutely nothing good can come from it. I can give you a hypothetical though. The pension fund decides to invest in the US government since it's a safe investment, and all other pension funds in the world also loan money to the United States government. If we look at all the money that's coming in and out of the pension fund, one thing would be the US loan payments. That's those loan payments that the US gives every year to the pension fund, very similar to how you give interest payments every month to your bank. If the US government said that it can't pay back its loans, but it can give you 50% back what it originally borrowed. This pension fund alone is in the red and now runs out of money. Teachers might straight up lose their retirement funds. Now abstract that dynamic and apply this to tens of thousands of pension funds across the entire world. Think of any government worker, police officers, firefighters, nurses, doctors, construction workers, transportation workers, airline workers, etc. All might straight up lose their retirement savings. You can think of a bank has your money and has US loans on their balance sheet purchased with your money. If the loans on the bank's balance sheet went down by 50%, the bank is now underwater. If it was revealed that the bank may not have your money, it would trigger a bank run. A similar thing happened to Silicon Valley Bank, where the value of its loans went down, triggering a bank run. All these companies that put their money in the bank almost lost their money. Abstract that dynamic and apply this to hundreds of banks. Long story short, no one knows directly what would happen, just know it would be the worst financial crisis in human history. In the next video, we'll talk about this mysterious third thing and what might be some of the design criteria and things that will push it in the right direction. It will require a completely different system, not capitalism, not socialism, not feudalism, not communism, none of these. We need to innovate on some things post Adam Smith and Karl Marx in order so we don't go extinct. If you like this video, make sure to give it a like and hit that subscribe button. This is only my second YouTube video, so I'm trying to get better at making these and releasing much sooner. I'm broke as all hell, so I have to do these off of a 10-year-old MacBook Pro. If you want to support my work so I can continually make videos and maybe even get a better machine, consider making a donation on PayPal or subscribing to my Patreon. On my Patreon, I release a Q&A video responding to many of the YouTube comments about the documentary. I also share a 6,000 word script as well as the design file for the 100+ infographics that I made just for this video. I also edit other people's videos. If you're interested in me editing one of your videos, shoot me an email. Links will be down in the description. Thank you so much, and until next time, happy Tuesday.